Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Welcome back to the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. I'm Michael Sirmon. And every week we explore practical ideas to help you think clearly, lead confidently, and live whole. I'm really glad that you're here today because I have a feeling this conversation is going to get very personal. Not because we're going to talk about your career or your finances or your marriage or any leadership position. Today, we're going to talk about that one relationship that influences every relationship in your life. The relationship you have with yourself. And I want to start with a question. Have you ever caught yourself saying something about yourself that you would never say to another human being? You know, maybe it's after a difficult meeting, or you've lost your temper, or you've made a bad decision, or maybe you forgot something important, or just dropped and broke something, right? We often mutter under our breath, or it's often out loud, "I'm such an idiot. I cannot believe I did that." Or, "What's wrong with me? You know what? I'm never going to get this right. I always screw things up." And you know, what's interesting is most of us don't even notice we're doing it anymore. It's just become normal. It's become background noise like the hum of an air conditioner. It's always there. But after a while, we stop hearing it until one day we realize that voice has been shaping our lives. And what fascinates me is that if it's our son or our daughter or our spouse or our best friend, if they did the exact same thing, made the exact same mistake, you probably wouldn't say any of those things. You'd say something like, "You know what, it's okay," or "We'll figure it out. We all make mistakes." You know what, you learn something. You'd extend grace. You'd tell the truth, but you'd extend grace. You'd encourage them to keep going. But when it comes to ourselves, it's different. When it comes to ourselves, we become the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and sometimes the executioner. Why? Why do intelligent, capable, successful people often become the cruelest voice they ever hear? And I think it's because we believe something that isn't true. We believe that being hard on ourselves is what makes us better, that guilt somehow creates growth, that shame produces excellence, and that if we don't punish ourselves, that we're going to stop improving. But today I want to challenge that belief because I think it's keeping far too many good people from becoming the great leaders that they're destined to be, right? Not because they aren't capable, but because they're trying to grow in an environment that no one could thrive in, even if that environment is inside their own mind. You know, years ago, I was walking through one of our manufacturing plants. Production had stopped for a few minutes because of a mistake. It was nothing catastrophic, right? No one was hurt. No equipment was damaged beyond repair. It was just one mistake, one moment, one employee. And by the time I got there, he already knew, right? His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were stayed on the floor. He wasn't trying to defend himself. He wasn't making excuses. He knew exactly what had happened. And as we talked, he looked at me and said, "I'm such an idiot." Not, "I made a mistake." Not, "I should have handled that differently." He didn't criticize his decision. He condemned himself. And I'll never forget thinking, how many times have I heard those exact words? Not just from employees. I've heard them from managers. I've heard them from executives. I've heard them from pastors, from friends, from parents, from coaching clients. And if I'm honest, I've heard them from myself. And maybe you've said something familiar, something like, "I'm a failure. I'm not going to change," or "I really should be further along by now," or "I keep making the same mistakes." But have we ever stopped long enough to ask, where did I learn to talk to myself this way? Because no one is born speaking to themselves like that. Somewhere, someone or something taught us that criticism is the price of growth. That if we're hard enough on ourselves, we will somehow become stronger. But let me ask you something. Have you ever seen it work in anyone's life? How about your own life? Right? Who helped you become the person you are today? Was it the teacher who humiliated you? Was it the boss who constantly reminded you of your failures, or the coach who only pointed out what you did wrong? I'd say probably not, right? The people who changed us the most, they challenged us. They corrected us. They expected more from us, but they also believed in us. They separated what we did from who we were becoming, because that's what great leaders do, right? Whether it's in the office, on the plant floor, at home, with your team, whatever it may be. Great leaders separate what we did from who we are becoming, which raises another question. If that's true, why do we refuse to lead ourselves that way? Right? I think one of the most dangerous lies we ever learn sounds incredibly responsible. It sounds disciplined. It sounds mature. That lie goes something like this. If I'm hard on myself, I'll become better. And maybe you've never said those exact words, but you've lived them. You made a mistake and immediately began punishing yourself. You replay the conversation. You rehearse everything you should have said. You question your judgment. You wonder if anyone noticed. You carry the weight of it home, then to bed, and sometimes into tomorrow. But why? Because somewhere deep inside, we convinced ourselves that if we make ourselves feel bad enough, we won't do it again. Almost like we're paying a penalty or penance. If I suffer enough over this mistake, I'll earn the right to move on. But have you ever noticed something? The mistakes you carry the longest aren't usually the ones that teach you the most. They're the ones that keep you stuck. And there's a huge difference between learning from failure and living in failure. One changes you, the other defines you, and they're not the same thing. Right? Think about someone you love. I want you to picture someone you care deeply about. Maybe it's your son or your daughter, your spouse, your friend. Right? Now, imagine they come to you after making a terrible decision. They're embarrassed. They're ashamed. They're disappointed in themselves. And they sit across from you and they say, I blew it. How do you respond? You lean across the table and say, you know what? You're probably right. You've always been a disappointment. Of course you don't. Right? You don't lower the standard. You don't pretend nothing happened. You don't excuse the mistake. You tell the truth, but you also remind them that one decision doesn't define who they are. You help them separate the event from their identity. So here's my question. Why do you deserve less grace than someone else? Now, don't misunderstand me. Grace is not pretending everything is okay. Grace is still telling the truth, but it's telling the truth without destroying the person hearing it. Right? Sometimes we think the opposite of grace is accountability, but it's not. The opposite of grace is shame. Accountability says you own what happened. Shame says you are what happened. And they are worlds apart. Right? Great leaders are very specific in how they develop people. And I've spent decades, working with people in different levels of leadership. And some of those years were incredibly rewarding. Some were incredibly humbling. I've led teams that were thriving. I've inherited teams that were struggling. I've seen million-dollar mistakes, and I've watched equipment fail. I've watched good people make poor decisions. But over those years, I learned something. The goal after the mistake isn't to make someone feel worse. The goal is to make them wiser. If all I accomplish is making someone feel guilty, then honestly, I failed as a leader. Because guilt alone doesn't build judgment. Learning does. Reflection does. Ownership does. Growth does. The best leaders I've ever known ask questions. Hey, what happened? What did you learn from that? What would you do differently next time? Notice they weren't asking what's wrong with you, right? Because there's a huge difference between investigating a decision and attacking a person's identity. One develops people, the other diminishes them. But here's the irony. Most of us understand this when we're leading others. Most of us understand this when we're interacting with our friends and with our family. But somehow we forget it when we're leading ourselves. right? But internal leadership matters. We spend a lot of time talking about leadership, right? We talk about how to communicate. We talk about how to delegate, how to build culture, how to influence people. But let me ask you something. Who is the first person you lead every single morning? It's not your team. It's not your family. It's you. Before you ever walk into a meeting, before you ever answer an email, before you make a decision, you're already leading someone. You're leading the person in the mirror. And every leader creates a culture. Think about that. Every leader creates a culture. So what kind of culture have you created inside your own mind? Is it a culture where mistakes become opportunities to learn, or a culture where mistakes become evidence that you'll never be enough? If someone else had to live in your internal culture for 1 week, would they leave encouraged or defeated? And that's not an easy question, but it's an important one. Because culture always shapes performance, right? Whether in a manufacturing plant, a family, a church, or your own heart. So one of my favorite moments in Scripture comes after the resurrection, right? Peter had every reason to quit. Think about what he had done. He didn't simply make a mistake. He denied even knowing Jesus, not once, but 3 times. So can you imagine the weight he carried, the shame, the regret, the self-condemnation? So if anyone deserved to hear you failed, it was Peter. But that's not what Jesus did, right? When they met on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus didn't begin with condemnation. He began with breakfast. And I love that, right? Before the correction, before the restoration, before the commission, there was a meal. Then Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Not to shame him, but to restore him. And then he said something remarkable. "Feed my sheep." In other words, I'm not finished with you, right? What Peter had done was real, but it wasn't the end of the story. Grace didn't erase accountability, but grace made redemption possible. And I wonder how many of us have accepted God's forgiveness, but rejected his view of us. We believe he can forgive us, but we just can't forgive ourselves. And somewhere along the way, we've mistaken ongoing self-punishment for humility. It isn't humility. It's unbelief. It's believing your verdict over his. So I would like to leave you with a thought that has changed the way I lead people and the way I try to lead myself. Every person has an inner voice. And the question isn't whether you have one. The question is, what role is that voice playing? Is it a prosecutor or a coach, right? A prosecutor's job is simple. Build a case, collect evidence, secure conviction. Every mistake becomes another exhibit. Every failure becomes proof. Every weakness becomes part of the argument. You always do this. You'll never change. I knew you weren't good enough, right? A prosecutor is only interested in winning the case, but a coach has a different purpose. A coach also tells the truth. A coach doesn't ignore the mistakes. A good coach doesn't pretend everything is okay, but a coach asks different questions. What happened? What can we learn? How do we get better, right? A coach believes your future can be different than your past. A prosecutor assumes your past predicts your future. But the hard question is, when you fail, which one shows up? The prosecutor or the coach? Because whichever voice you listen to the most will eventually shape the person you become. But you know me, I love 3 questions. And I think there are 3 questions that can change everything, right? It's just something practical, right? Not because life is solved with 3 questions, but because sometimes we need something simple enough to remember when emotions are running high. So the next time you catch yourself spiraling after a mistake, pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, what actually happened? Not what story am I telling myself, but what happened? And stick to the facts. Too often we confuse facts with conclusions or facts with assumptions. The story may be I missed a deadline. The conclusion becomes I'm irresponsible. They're not the same thing. The fact is observable. The conclusion is a story. So separate the 2. Second question, what can this teach me? Right? Every mistake offers one of 2 things, a lesson or a life sentence. You decide which one it becomes. I've learned more from some of my failures than I've ever learned from my successes. Because failures have a way of exposing blind spots, revealing assumptions, refining character. but only if we're willing to learn instead of simply relive them. So don't waste your pain. Learn from it. And question 3, maybe the most important one. If someone I loved came to me with this exact situation, what would I tell them? Would you remind them of every failure they've ever made? Would you tell them they're hopeless? Would you question their worth? Would you tell the truth? I think you'd probably say something like, yes, you made a mistake. Now let's figure out what to do next. So here's my challenge. Start offering yourself the same honesty, the same accountability, and the same grace that you freely give others, right? Not because you deserve special treatment, but because you deserve truthful treatment. So one of the reasons I wanted to record this episode is because this isn't just personal, it's actually leadership. The way we lead ourselves always leaks into the way we lead others. So if we believe people only grow through criticism, our team will eventually feel it. Your children will feel it, your spouse will feel it, your friends will feel it. But if you understand that people grow best when truth and grace walk together, everything changes. You'll begin to ask better questions. You become more patient, more curious. You stop trying to prove people wrong and start helping them become better. Because leadership isn't about lowering expectations. Leadership is about creating an environment where people can meet them. And that includes the person you see in the mirror every morning. So can I be honest with you for a moment? Right? I've had seasons where I carried mistakes far longer than I should have. I replayed conversations, second-guessed decisions, wondered if I had what it took. And maybe you've been there too, right? But I've also learned something over the years. I've never became a better leader because I spent another week beating myself up. I've become a better leader because I was willing to face the truth, learn the lesson, make things right when I could, and keep moving forward. Because growth doesn't come from living in yesterday. It comes from learning from yesterday, right? And that's different. So let me leave you with one final thought. Tomorrow morning, you're probably going to get up and look in the mirror. You'll notice something. You'll notice maybe another gray hair, a wrinkle that wasn't there the day before. And if you're like me, you'll notice that losing a few pounds is getting harder than it used to be. But that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is what happens after you look up, right? Because almost certainly a voice begins to speak. Sometimes it's encouraging, sometimes it's condemning, sometimes it's truthful, sometimes it's been repeating the same lie for years. So listen carefully to that voice, not because it's always right, but because it's incredibly influential. If it's reminding you of something that's true, hold on to it. And if it's telling you that one mistake defines your future, challenge it. If it tells you that you are beyond hope, don't believe it, right? You're not your worst day. You are not your greatest failure. You are not the sum total of your regrets. You're a person who's still growing, still learning, still becoming. Because the goal isn't to think more highly of yourself. The goal is to think more truthfully. Because the greatest leader you'll ever lead is the person you're becoming. So lead that person well. Thank you for spending these few minutes with me today. And if this episode resonated with you, I have a favor to ask. First, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Chances are someone in your life is carrying a burden of shame they were never meant to carry. And this conversation might be exactly what they need. If you're enjoying the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast, I'd be honored if you'd follow the show, subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a rating and review, and share it with others. Because every like, every review, every share helps these conversations reach more people who are looking to think clearly, lead confidently, and live whole. And if you'd like to go deeper, I'd love to connect with you. You'll find leadership resources, coaching information, books, articles, and more at michaelsirmon.com or on LinkedIn. And remember, you don't have to be perfect to become better. You just have to be willing to keep growing. So until next time, lead well, live whole. If today's conversation raised a question you've been wrestling with, I'd love to help. I offer one-on-one coaching for individuals navigating pressure, transition, and important decisions. You can learn more at michaelsirmon.com.